Hello, you're listening to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Haldane. On this episode, I'm going to be speaking to Sky Sports commentator and author Andy Clarke about his new book, The Knockout, Sport's Most Decisive Moment. Gosh, I can't tell the listeners how excited I am to be recording this next episode with Sky Sports commentator for boxing and author Andy Clarke, whose book, The Knockout, Sport's Most Decisive Moment, is going to be the topic of this conversation at the Fiore Truck in Forest Gate. Not an easy place to find unless you've got Google Maps. And even then, I would say you'd struggle a bit. You were right, Andy, to give me a long voice note where you gave the directions in painstaking detail. Podcasters are expert at leaving the longest voice notes, as their friends will testify to. It's wonderful to meet you. For as long as I've been watching boxing, your face has appeared, your commentary widely respected, your views are widely sought after. And this book, I think, gets to the nub of what keeps boxing in many ways alive as a sport in the imaginations of its fans and other spectators. And that is the phenomenon of the knockout. In a previous episode, I'll just say this. With Tom Holland, the historian and co-host of the Rest is History podcast, I asked him whether his fascination with Roman gladiators made him even a semi-part-time fan of combat sports. And alas, he said it did not. But you're a classicist, going back to your days at university. And so I kind of want to dig back into your own history to start with where it is that you came into boxing from.
It's a good question because there was no obvious reason why I would end up getting into boxing the way that I did. I was heavily into sport, played sport as soon as I could stand up. My dad was always into it. He wasn't a pushy kind of dad or anything like that, but he just introduced me and my brother, who's 2 years older than me, to it. And we both really, really liked it. But boxing wasn't one of the sports because it wasn't in schools. And unless you knew where your local club was, or you knew someone who did it, and there was a reason to follow them down there, then you weren't really going to end up doing it. So I didn't box when I was a kid, but I played loads of other sports, and I loved it. I loved the competition of it. All team sports. And I'm kind of curious as to what would happen if I'd gone down the road of an individual sport. But I was always kind of fascinated by it. And I mentioned it in the book. The first time I saw it was on the TV, or the first time I remember, 1986. And it was a knockout that I remember because Darren Dyer, who was a really good amateur fighter, welterweight fighter, won by knockout in the ABA finals. And it was kind of on grandstand. Either it was recorded during the week and then played at the weekend, or I can't remember. But I just remember seeing that. And then I remember seeing him in the Commonwealth Games later that summer, knocking people out, which you didn't generally see in the amateurs that much. And it was that spectacle that just drew me in because there was just something about it. It was like nothing else. Watching two people fight is exciting anyway. But the fact that it was over when he did that it's not like other sports. You know, I just found that kind of fascinating.
How did it feel to first see that knockout? I mean, as you say, you'd been active in sports, but they'd mostly been team sports, you know. Teams win together, they lose together. There's a sort of diffusion, isn't there, of the glories and of the grief. How was it to see that first time where one person alone has to suffer that in front of everybody?
I think I was probably a bit confused by it to start with because I couldn't quite work out why it was over. Why was the other bloke not getting up? What's actually happened here? And then you realise what has happened. And it's not like it's something that's completely foreign to you because, you know, you'll have seen a fight probably before that, maybe not in real life, but you've seen it on the TV and films and all the rest of it. So you're aware of what that dynamic is. But as a sporting contest, I was aware of it, I would say, of boxing. But then when I saw it for the first time, there was just something about it that just fascinated me, really. I wouldn't say that my friends were in it particularly, or all through my kind of, childhood and teenage years. But it was a sport that it had a good following. Like now, a big fight will suck people in a way that other sports don't. It attracts a casual audience, this big casual audience that's always there for it in a way that other sports can't really.
Yeah, when the big fights manage to get made, of course. Can you put your finger on what it was about the knockout when you say there was something about it?
It's just the danger of it, I think. It's the jeopardy of it. It's just kind of understanding that in this sport, this can happen at any second and it's over. And these were quite heavy knockouts as well. This guy was scoring Darren Dyer. He wasn't just kind of snapping their head back and the referee jumped in. He was dropping people, which, again, in the amateurs, you didn't normally see. So that's mid-80s. And then off the back of that, I was aware of Frank Bruno, and then you've got Bruno Tyson, and then you've got Tyson, and then you're into Nigel Benn against Chris Eubank. And at that point, I was well down the rabbit hole by that point.
By the time you go to university in the 90s, was there any link between your love of boxing, your fascination with it, and that particular subject?
No, none.
Because that's where we first see, as you say, the first description of a knockout is written in, I think, the Iliad.
And the Colosseum is what boxing always gets compared to. No, there was not at all. But it was, when I started writing the book, I knew that was going to make it in, and it just kind of entertained me, like to get my kind of degree becoming at long last somehow relevant to what I did for a living. I just found the idea of that quite entertaining. But because I started in football at TalkSport, there was no link to my career from my degree other than a really, really basic one, which was that I did classics because I found it really interesting. I wasn't thinking about what it might lead to. I just did it because I knew that would be 3 years well spent in terms of I would just really enjoy it and want to do it, and it wouldn't be a chore, and I'd be genuinely enthused by it. And so when it came to getting a job, it had to be the same way. It didn't occur to me that I could just do something just for the money. Right. And that's a privileged position to be in. I've always understood that because not everybody gets to make that decision and pursue something that they know that, or they suspect that they're really going to love. People don't have that option a lot of the time. But I did, and there was no way that I wasn't going to take it.
So just a happy accident, I guess, that these two subjects in your life did have that important overlap. The book's subtitle, Sport's Most Decisive Moment, is interesting. Why is the knockout not just boxing's, but sport's most decisive moment? Football fans will say, well, what about the penalty shootout? Basketball fans will maybe point to the last 15 seconds of a game. But there's something about boxing, you say, that makes it the most decisive moment you could possibly hope for in any sport.
Yeah, no, I absolutely stick to that, basically because it just renders everything obsolete. It renders the competition obsolete. It renders the clock obsolete, most importantly, because you can score a decisive last-minute basket goal, but you have to be within striking distance for it to matter. In boxing, you could be comprehensively losing the fight and switch it around in one punch in the blink of an eye. And there's just something really, really dramatic about all of a sudden, from nowhere, something that 1 second was so pregnant with possibility being over. And you do get it in a penalty shootout, but you kind of know that's coming. You know, somebody walks up to the spot. If they score, they're through. If they miss, they're out. You know, there's a build to it. In a knockout, there's no build. You know, it can happen at any point. And the finality of it and the suddenness of it is just quite weird, to be honest, when you watch it at ringside. Sometimes you can see it coming. The other night at Wembley, after he got put down so heavy in the first round, Anthony Joshua, you felt like Daniel Dubois was probably going to knock him out. But not necessarily, because the referee might stop it or the corner might stop it. But then when he did get knocked out, it was still that big gasp moment because he was on the front foot himself, and then all of a sudden he's face planted and he's struggling to get up, and it's over, and you've got 96,000 people all just coming to terms with what has just happened, and the fighters have to come to terms with what has just happened, and it's a really tight space. So if in football you score, say like a golden goal is what I mentioned in the book as being the only thing to it I've seen in my sports viewing lifetime. Trezeguet smashes one in the final of Euro 2000 to score a golden goal in extra time, I think it was. The Italians all slump to the turf and the French all just run around like lunatics. But in boxing, it's 20 square feet. There's nowhere to go. So you're right on top of your opponent, sometimes your stricken, fallen opponent, and you're celebrating maybe for a split second, but if they're not moving, then you're probably going to stop. And you're all milling around, sharing this same oxygen with wildly different conflicting emotions. It's that kind of really stark juxtaposition and close proximity that just makes it like nothing else.
And we saw an example of this not long ago. We're talking on the 26th of September 2024, and on the 21st earlier this month, we saw Joshua and Dubois enter the ring in Wembley Stadium in front of a packed, I think it was 96,000 pairs of eyes watching them. One for the ages, but not without those very moments that you describe. I have to apologise to long-time listeners of the podcast at this stage, because I realise that my passion, my obsession with boxing has meant that I ran straight past the fact that we're sat here at the Fiore truck. We haven't talked about it at all, have we? What makes this your favourite restaurant, Andy?
So me and Amir, my wife, have lived around here probably for about, nearly 7 years now. And Mauro and Rosario, who run this, originally it was a mobile truck, and they used to park it up in various places, kind of all pretty near here. But you would find out on their Instagram Thursday, Friday, like where they were going to be that night. I mean, it was all legit. They had the permits and everything. It was just sometimes they would go to one place, sometimes they would go to another. So we tried it and just really, really enjoyed it. I think Amir and Rosario kind of bonded because they both running businesses. Mauro is too. So I think the three of them kind of bonded, and I was there as well, if you like, because my wife runs a business making chocolate, and she's kind of put it on hold for a bit at the minute. But so they had that in common, just the struggles of working in the food and drink sector and doing your own thing. And it's hard. It's really, really hard. So there'd be a lot of chat about that whenever we went down. And then they moved here 3 years ago, and they've just done really well ever since. We've not been here as much as we should have been since they made it their permanent place. But it's just really, they're just really nice people.
Oh, I love the fact that you occupy this world of men getting in the ring and beating each other up. Meanwhile, your wife is there living in the world of chocolate making. This sort of lovely, sweet world by contrast to the blood bespattered realm that you occupy.
It is different.
It feels to me that the power of the knockout has a particular resonance in our culture today, because in an age of mass communication, riven with discord and weaponized with misleading content, the knockout gives us the rare satisfaction of seeing an argument won for all to see in no uncertain terms. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I think that over the last decade, maybe, I think society has maybe regressed a bit, if that's quite the right word, and that people are a bit more bloodthirsty now. They embrace confrontation a bit more now than they used to. It seems to be more acceptable now to really get on the front foot and start an argument and be quite aggressive.
What do you think's caused that?
I think things have got very binary. I think it's, and you see it when people talk about the way they support sport. I know football club support has always been what it is, but outside of that, other sports have always been different. But what I've noticed in boxing now is just to give boxing as an example, is that it's much more the case than it used to be that you're either for something or you're against it. When I was a kid, for example, Ben and Eubank were the two big fighters, the great rivalry. I liked both of them. Like, I didn't, I liked Eubank more, but I really liked Nigel Benn, and it wasn't strange to me that you could do that. Whereas now I think it's kind of, are you this or are you that? And people like the idea of a knockout as a means of resolution because it is so unambiguous and unapologetic. People like things and people who are unapologetic now. And that as an adjective generally means that they're an arsehole, but that's kind of what they mean by it.
I think that's right. And I think even though the 90s was an era where people did really choose between one brand, so to speak, or another, whether it was Eubank or Ben or Oasis, if you're going to talk about music, and those two worlds have crossed recently in the run-up to Joshua Dubois. But it seems that today there's always a backstory, a narrative that threads through boxing matches. There was always fight talk, but now you have practically the Housewives of Beverly Hills going on in the background to boxing, don't you? And it really makes people lust after somebody's demise in ways that I think probably differ from previous eras.
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of that's down to the digital platform and social media and people knowing more about somebody, because boxers are very active on it and they run their own accounts almost exclusively. And so you really do feel like you get to know them, and you'll catch them in those unguarded moments that might make you like them or might make you hate them. If somebody's firing off late at night when, really they should know better, and they'll commit indiscretions kind of more willingly almost than a lot of other athletes, because they don't have the kind of sponsorships and corporate responsibilities that other athletes do, because things like that, they're not really interested in boxing. It's not for them. They've never really liked it because it's people hitting each other. So they're kind of unbridled of all of that. So they will just really be who they are, be completely authentic. And that can be quite divisive. So I think that's a reason why people choose to kind of invest in those backstories and really put some emotion and energy of their own into it in a way that you wouldn't necessarily if you were talking about a tennis player or a golfer or something like that. And the interesting thing for me as well about the idea that you're wishing somebody's demise and watching somebody get chinned is just the greatest thing to happen if they're not someone you like. There is definitely an element of that. And that tableau of watching someone on the ground and someone standing over them and the crowd are going wild, it does look like everyone is celebrating the fact that he got knocked out and that everyone's against that person. Everybody wanted that to happen and now it's here. And that's why I think it has that kind of savage look to it. It's not just the physical violence of it, it's the fact that we were all rabid for it, foaming at the mouth, waiting to watch this man get semi-decapitated, when actually that's not really it. The shock of the moment is just the fact that it's happened. It doesn't really matter who it's happened to, but it's hard for people to shift that from their mind, is that you've got the mob there who came to see this, and they came to see it specifically to happen to that person, or they came just to see one. They don't care who it happens to. So long as one of you two gets knocked out, then our bloodlust will be satisfied and we'll go home happy. And that's why people compare it to the Colosseum, because that is what people went there for, and they knew that they'd be guaranteed it. Or a bullfight, it's the bullfight's the same. Like the score is the same every week if you go to a bullfight. I've been to one because I wanted to see what it was like, and I enjoyed the kind of ritual of it. I enjoyed the ceremony of it, but I wouldn't necessarily go and see one again. But I do think that, well, one thing I've noticed is that every now and again you get a fatality in boxing. We haven't had too many in the UK in the last 10 years, but every now and again you get one. And when I was a kid, that always seemed to lead to news articles and items on the television news about banning boxing and how can we allow this? It's barbaric, it's this, it's that. I can't remember the last time the British Medical Association or whoever it usually was has got involved in that argument. It just seems to have disappeared. And that in itself I find really interesting.
Yeah, but I wondered whether you relate to this arc from the point of a knockout to, I'd say, a good 15, 20 minutes after, where that feeling of vindication or that bloodlust, that desire for retribution is very quickly converted into a desire for that person's redemption.
Totally. And that switch, that turnaround can happen quite fast, because what it does is expose just the ultimate in human vulnerability. Particularly heavyweight, you'll see these guys. But anyway, they're highly trained, they're in phenomenal shape, they've got the kind of willpower and mental fortitude that very few people have got. They've got the kind of conditioning to pain and tolerance to pain that almost nobody has. They have the ability to recover and fight on when they're concussed, which is something that no one's expected to do in any other sport. No one's allowed to do in any other sport. You've got all of those things. But then when you see someone just with their balance gone because their coordination has left them because they've been hit too hard, and all of a sudden they're wide open and they're so vulnerable, and they're so human, it's just, you can't help it but feel sorry for them. And if they then in the ring afterwards, and this often happens because a fighter's most honest reaction is always their first one, when they've been beaten, particularly if they've been knocked out, they will almost always be disarmingly honest and just say something along the lines of, he hit me with a good shot, this is the game I'm in, the best man won on the night, all the luck in the world to him. They might change their mind a few weeks later when they're trying to explain the defeat and sell it to themselves, because that doesn't really work from a rehabilitation point of view. But on the night, and if someone then says that, again, you look at it and you just think, like, this is not a bad guy. This is not a bad guy. And people will love a fighter more if they've seen him in that state. Floyd Mayweather would be much more generally beloved if he'd got knocked out and then come back, and people had seen him like that. He's one of the very few people who it hasn't happened to, who's boxed at that level for that long. It's all stopped. If you don't get knocked out, the referee stops it because they say you've had enough. Almost everybody finds themselves in that position. If he'd agreed to fight Golovkin, Mayweather, which he was right not to, and he got knocked out deep in an absolute ding-dong and showed incredible bravery, people would love him for it. They would love him for it because they almost want to see someone reduced to that.
If you look at the superheroes that our culture has produced, fictional superheroes, the ones that people love most are the ones that are complicated, the ones that have gone through a redemptive arc, the ones that have darkness, the ones that have faced their fears, the ones that have been beaten down. nobody really, I mean, apologies to Superman fans, but Superman must be the least loved of all the superheroes because he's Invincible Man of Steel.
Yeah,
right? He's an
that's
overachiever.
No fun, is it?
A bit like Mayweather.
Yeah, that's no fun.
I think the only boxer who hasn't gotten knocked out that you can say people still love is Alexander Usyk, simply because he represents something, I think, bigger than the sport and the way he conducts himself.
And it might not happen to him because I don't think he's got too much longer left. But I don't think it'll matter with him. But he'll be one of the very, very few, because you just know that he was always willing to roll the dice and go there and put himself in that position where it could happen, and he was aware of the risks. It is a really interesting thing, you know. Eubank Senior, for example, was mostly reviled. Most people didn't like him. I loved him, but most people didn't. But then he got in with Joe Calzaghe and took not a beating, but he was well beaten. And people loved him for it. They loved him for it. And then the fights, you know, towards the end of his career, he got a lot more love showing real heart and courage in a losing cause than he ever did when he won. And that's just human nature, in a way, I think. It's odd.
You mentioned the psychology of the knockout, and we'll come back to that. The fact that when a fighter is knocked out, sometimes what happens is they'll have this moment of clarity in the ring, and then no sooner have they entered the changing rooms than narratives might start to mutate where they can't quite accept it, so they'll come up with excuses or alibis that distance themselves from that loss. But what about the physiology of a knockout? What happens to the body's system when a person gets knocked out?
This was one of my favourite bits, actually, because the guy I spoke to about this was Neil Scott, who's the Chief Medical Officer at the British Boxing Board of Control. I see him all the time. And now he knows that I'm really into this and concussion and how you spot it. We have WhatsApp exchanges after almost every fight we're at together. And it was the same after last weekend with Dubois and Joshua.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, because I knew at the end of the first round, when Dubois knocked Joshua down heavily, that was a big enough punch that there is no recovering from that unless you do it to them.
Okay, well, for those who didn't see that fight, let's just jump in and talk about Joshua Dubois now. If you can give a brief summary of what happened in that fight.
So what happened in that fight was, at the end of the first round, Dubois hit Joshua with a big right hand, put him down, and he got back to his feet, but it was the end of the round, so he then had a minute to recover. If he hadn't had a minute to recover, I think Dubois would have jumped on him and stopped him. From that point onwards, looking at it, after speaking to Neil, he was concussed, Joshua. And that is a binary thing. It's like ringing a bell. You can't unring it. Once it's happened, and you don't actually come out of it. You just somehow cope with it. So you're either concussed or you're not. You won't get concussed at the end of round 1, and then by round 7 you've shaken it off. It stays. You know, it's an impact. It's a deep impact. And so from that point onwards, he was always going to be, the writing was on the wall basically, and the only chance he had was to do the same thing to Dubois so that it's a level playing field. And you see that in fights. People might not be aware, but you see that's where you've got two fighters who are both concussed, and that's when they look like they're really, really tired, and their reactions aren't what they were, and their balance doesn't seem to be what it is, and they both seem to be on the point of collapse at any stage. That will be exhaustion to an extent, but likely in that mix you've got concussion. And when you can kind of spot it, it explains a lot. But basically what happens when somebody gets hit is, as Neil described it, if you get hit on the jaw, basically this shock wave goes around your lower mandible, which is basically like your lower jaw, which is basically like a horseshoe shape. And it goes into your jaw joints, at which point it can cause a break, and you get that sometimes. If it doesn't, it'll pass through into the base of your skull, into your brainstem. And if the force is sufficient, then there will be a kind of defense mechanism system shut down, and you'll black out basically, and then come round at some stage. And how difficult it is to do to somebody and how quickly they'll recover is a completely individual thing. And when I talked to him, he did say, look, this is a difficult thing you've chosen to write about because no one really knows the answer to this, basically. But you get hit hard enough, and the blackout is a defense mechanism. The system just goes into overload, if you like, and shuts down. Sonny Liston actually gave a really good description of what happens inside your head, and neurosurgeons agree that this is actually a good description, although obviously he's got no qualifications in that area, but he does when it comes to getting hit. And how he described it is that basically your brain is sitting in a series of cups inside your head. And if you get hit hard, then the brain, a jelly-like substance, will basically kind of like slop around in the cups, but it'll stay in the cups. So you're okay. If you get hit hard enough that it slops out of the cups, then you get knocked out. And when it kind of rights itself and slops back in again, that's when you'll regain consciousness. And if you talk to doctors about that, they say, actually, that's not bad, as a summary of what happens, because your brain is basically sitting in fluid inside your skull. And a violent enough impact will make it rattle around too much and you'll lose consciousness. So Sonny Liston was kind of, that's pretty much it, really.
Wow, it's a graphic and scary description.
It is, which is why you can see someone get hit and their eyes roll up and you can see that they're knocked out and their body loses that tensile strength and they'll just drop, like an old casino that's been detonated. It's like they've been turned off, and then they'll go into their back and they'll hit the canvas with the back of their head, and that will wake them up somehow because they're unconscious, like the brain is out of the cups, and then their head will hit the canvas, send it back into the cups, they'll regain consciousness. It doesn't always happen, but it can happen. It's a really fascinating thing.
How many times was Sonny Liston knocked out in his career?
Well, you could argue never, because towards the end, I'm not sure, but at his peak, there was the phantom punch against Ali, where people just don't really buy it.
They don't really buy it. But then, this is why I ask, his description of what happens
it must
is
have happened
so
to
accurate.
him. Yeah, it must have happened to him. Or in the gym, or something like that.
Yeah.
Loads of gym stories where people talk about getting buzzed, as they would describe it, and the short-term memory effects it has on you, and just the general effect it has on you. And simply put, the effect of getting hit hard enough whereby you're buzzed or concussed, which is the reality, is that of being drunk, basically.
The starters have arrived, so let's pause, enjoy, and come back to this. Andy, we had the artichoke hearts drizzled with balsamic, these lovely baked flatbreads, and this Tuscan sausage. What did you think? Good as ever?
Yeah, I thought very good. I've not had the Tuscan sausage before, but a bit of fennel, a little bit of aniseed, yeah.
There's nothing like it.
You can't go wrong with Italian food, can you?
No, you just can't.
You never leave an Italian meal unsatisfied, I don't think.
Two blokes talking over an Italian meal about boxing. We should be putting on the accents at this point. How did you personally feel this time around when you saw the knockout that sent Joshua to the canvas in the 5th round? I guess what I'm hinting at is that effect you write about on the audience of the knockout.
It was a bit different. I've seen a few knockouts since I finished the book. Quite a few, actually. It's one of those things where you feel like it's something that doesn't happen all that much, and then actually you realise it happens quite a lot. And it has changed the way that I look at it, because with this one, for example, I knew that the likelihood was, after he got dropped at the end of the 1st round, that he may well get knocked out. And then when he did get caught by Dubois and put down, I could tell immediately that he wasn't going to get up. Like previously, a couple of years previously, when I was commentating, I might have said, and it's got to 6, the count's got to 6, and he's trying again, he's struggling. But I knew immediately that it wasn't going to happen. And I just said straight away, Joshua's going to get counted out and knocked out here, because he's never going to be able to beat this count. He's struggling manfully, but he can't do it. Which I kind of found interesting, because it brought a level of understanding to what I was seeing that I hadn't previously had, basically. And that's from just looking at and thinking about the knockout in such depth. And the fact that he did get back to his feet, assisted by his corner, I looked at him and I thought, okay, you look okay. And that's the main thing, because you said it yourself, you want them to get back to their feet. People want to see a knockout, but very quickly they could wish they hadn't seen it if someone's just flat out on their back unconscious and the medics are hurrying in looking worried. So we didn't have that. So I actually really enjoyed it. It was a guilt-free knockout for me. I could see that although he was trying to get back to his feet, he wasn't going to be able to, therefore he would be counted out and it would be a knockout, but he wasn't actually knocked out. He wasn't knocked unconscious and just lying glass-eyed on the floor or eyes closed. We didn't get that. And when you get that, it's different. It was kind of a perfect stadium pay-per-view box office knockout because there was no bitter aftertaste to it. There wasn't that gnawing sense of dread you get, accompanied by a bit of guilt when you see someone get, like Francis Ngannou, for example. So Joshua boxed Francis Ngannou in Riyadh back at the start of March.
Yeah.
And at the start of the second round, having knocked him down twice, he knocked him down in the first round, then again in the second round, and he got back up Ngannou, this 20-stone absolute machine of a man. Tyson Fury could do anything to him in terms of his punch power, and you could see that he was an open target, and you knew what was going to happen next. The overwhelming likelihood was that Joshua was going to step in and knock him out. And that's exactly what happened. And some thought it was a little bit unnecessary, but sometimes a knockout is a natural conclusion to a fight, and it shouldn't be denied, because Ngannou got back to his feet, and he would rather have got knocked out than the referee stop it. Which sounds mad to us, but that's just how they are. But he was flat on his back, unconscious, for a good while, and at that point, for all you know, he could be dead.
Reflecting on the Joshua Dubois fight and reading the book, I was drawn to the chapter on fear, where you say that the fear of something happening in life is almost always worse than the thing actually happening. I think that's broadly true. Do you think Anthony Joshua's worst fears were realised in the ring on Saturday last weekend? That fear of being returned to that place he found himself in against Ruiz back in 2017.
I do, yeah.
And if so, to what extent do you think it might be the very thing he needed to overcome his fears? And do you think that stands him in any better stead for a possible rematch with Dubois and just future fights?
So first part of the question, yes, I think it is what he's been dreading since Ruiz.
Becoming a meme.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's going to help him.
Okay.
What happened to him at the weekend? Basically because he's 34 now. That was a damaging defeat. When he got beaten by Ruiz, he got caught high on the head. In a fight that he was doing really well in, and that punch completely flipped the script. And then from that point onwards, he was concussed, and it was an uphill battle. And he kept going down, but getting back up. And in the end, the referee decided enough was enough. When he got beat twice by Usyk, he was outmaneuvered and outpunched and out everythinged. But at no point, apart from late in the second fight, did he really look like he was going to unravel. And he did a lot better in the second fight than he did in the first. But against Dubois, from the very first second, he was under the cosh and he stayed there. Apart from those two right hands he landed just before he got knocked out. So it was a pretty thorough beat down, really. And they're hard to get over. They're probably the hardest category of knockout there is to get over, because even though Joshua got stopped by Ruiz, I don't think he ever would have believed that something like Saturday night could happen to him, even though people have been telling them that he's got a glass jaw and all that usual nonsense. I don't think he would have believed that somebody could just hand it to him like that. It would have been a fear, because since Ruiz, no one has really stepped on him and done what Dubois did. And that's really difficult to cope with, whoever you are. It doesn't mean you've got some kind of innate weakness, but if you start badly and they get the momentum and they're a big puncher, that's a massive problem for anyone. And that's what happened. And it's kind of what they all fear, to be honest, to be under the cosh in the way that he was. So it definitely would have been one of his deepest fears as a fighter to be dismantled like that. But I don't think that it'll facilitate any kind of reset whereby he feels like he needed that in any way, because no one needs that.
You used the phrase there, glass jaw, again for the uninitiated among our listeners. Glass jaw, weak around the whiskers, chinny. These are phrases that are often thrown out by fans that, as we were discussing earlier over our first courses, tend to view fights in a very cartoonish, binary way. And you say that these phrases are really a form of ignorant nonsense, because any fighter hit with a shot they don't expect can get knocked out. There's no such thing as a chinnier fighter. But some fighters are remarkably absorbent to headshots, aren't they? There are fighters who take shots very well. Do you think that there is some truth, therefore, to the idea that a boxer can be particularly vulnerable compared to another?
Obviously, everybody's different, so you will get some people who can't take a punch as well as somebody else. As for them having any kind of inherent weakness, I think really if you allow yourself to get hit, then that's the problem. But like you say, you do get people who have been hit hard and clean, plenty, including with punches they didn't really see and never been knocked out. Frotch is my great example in the book of someone who never got knocked out, amateur or pro. Jamie Moore's in there and same, it never happened to him. Everybody else, at some point, it happened to them. As for why that is, no one really can explain it. The neck muscles, if I had supersonic neck muscles and you didn't, we're both civilians, that would mean that I would be harder to knock out than you. But in professional boxing, you've got to assume that they're all highly trained and they've all been doing their exercises. So no one's going to have neck muscles that are that superior and the like of which have never been seen by medical science, that they're going to be that much harder to knock out. So really it comes down to, in the end, individual, as Neil described it to me, the Dr. Neil Scott, in your individual physiology. And when you start talking about something like that, that's very vague. And he left it vague for a reason, because he doesn't know the answer. Nobody knows the answer. In that realm, you can come down to more of a spiritual kind of thing. Like Teddy Atlas was really interesting on this in the book, a very experienced trainer. He just said, why is it that there are some fighters who have been knocked out quite a few times and others who, despite taking all these big shots, haven't been? And he said it's because they refuse to oblige the knockout. Apart from that one punch that you don't see, which anybody can get taken out by, every other knockout for him is a decision. It's a decision you've made. Now that's a really hard line stance to take. But in a way, you can see what he's saying, because your body is deciding, and therefore your mind is deciding, due to the pain from the body, that it can't do this anymore. And you're obliging the knockout. And there are some people out there, he says, who just won't do it. And he referred to Ali, where Ali talked about what it feels like to get buzzed, to get hurt. And he said it's this really confusing, disorienting experience, essentially. And you get this siren song, you get this thing called the near room, as he describes it, that beckons to you. It's full of snakes playing trumpets and clowns and neon lights. It's really confusing, weird thing. But it's beckoning you in, And you've got to refuse it. Because, you know, if you open that door and go into that room, it will be what it looks like. And you're kind of signing up to your own mutually assured self-destruction, I think was what he said. You have to say no to that. Some people say no and some people don't. You know, it's like going towards the light. Are you going to head towards the light or are you not? And in that split second where you're not even really conscious, the idea that something within you determines whether you do that or not is quite attractive, I think. And why not? Why shouldn't it be that? Because what is it if it isn't? And when you meet someone like Frotch, you kind of feel like, yeah, I could sort of get it, that somehow you might be that one person in however many who you won't have it for whatever reason.
Ali's description of the near room is brilliant. I mean, commentators are great, but there's nothing quite like a boxer who's a wordsmith as well, who can go in there, fight, and come back and give the most colourful reportage from inside.
But if you ask them all about stuff like this, they are really good on it, you know. Yeah. It's because they don't normally get asked. Amir Khan was great.
You have some great interviews in that book.
Yeah, Amir Khan was awesome because I didn't have much time with him. And most of the people I spoke to for the book I knew, or at least knew where I was, but I didn't really know them all that well. So I had to jump on him quite quick in Saudi Arabia one time. And he knew I wanted to talk about a knockout. And I said, what was it like against Brady Prescott? Because when he was quite young, he'd had 18 fights and 18 wins. This is off the back of an Olympic silver medal. Big star. Next big thing. And he boxed this Colombian banger called Brady Prescott. Big puncher. It shouldn't really have happened. Frank Warren, his promoter, didn't want it. He thought he was a wrong opponent. But they took it. And he got put down really heavy, very early. Somehow scrambled back to his feet. His balance wasn't there. And the referee should really have stopped it. But he let it go on, and then he got flattened again. And somehow managed to kind of, on probably about the count of 12 if the referee kept going, somehow managed to get back up. But he was describing, he was the best person I have for describing what it's like to almost get knocked out, because you ask someone, what's it like to get knocked out cold, and they can't tell you because they can't remember it. They might feel like they can, and they'll give you what they have then come up with as being their version of events, but it doesn't really mean anything because those are memories inserted after the event because you can't remember it. But Amir Khan described it, getting really hit really hard and not really knowing where you are, as like a jigsaw puzzle going smash. and you've got to put all the pieces back together in under 10 seconds. And I was just standing there looking at him, and this was straight off the top of his head because he wasn't really even expecting me. He didn't really know what I wanted to talk about. And I was standing there just thinking, holy shit, like that's an amazing description.
That drives it straight home, doesn't it? You write in the book, I've never harboured any troubling inner conflict about watching people fight, but I have seen it in others. You've already alluded, though, in the conversation to feelings of guilt. And I alluded to it earlier when I spoke about that desire almost as soon as the knockout is performed for the redemption of the one who's knocked out, that they can rise up, that we can love them for what they've just been through, love them for what they have learned in that process, love them for what we would learn in that process were we in their shoes. Have you or your colleagues ever confessed after a fight to feeling guilty about what they've just witnessed? Is that something which, even if you felt it, you might never admit to your colleagues or peers?
Funnily enough, I think most of the people I know who have struggled have been writers rather than broadcasters. I don't know whether there's any reason for that, but generally that seemed to me to be how that's kind of broken down. But I don't really know why. I think I empathise. Well, I can't really empathise because it's never happened to me.
Yeah.
And it never will.
But you say you don't feel an inner conflict.
No, I don't. And I think the main reason I don't is because they are in there of their own volition and they do know the risks and this is something they want to do. And they know that this could happen to them. Sometimes people paint this picture of fighters and it's people who don't support boxing or who intermittently used to call for it to be banned would go down this route of, oh, these are these poor, simple souls who don't really know what they're getting themselves into, being robbed blind by these greedy, more educated money men promoters. That's just absolute nonsense and really insulting, actually, to boxers. They know exactly what they're getting into. And that's why there was a book to be written about this, because they know the risks. And they live with them in a number of different ways. They justify it to themselves in a number of different ways. They survive it, living that life by all sorts of cunning mental gymnastics, to be honest with you. But they know exactly what they're getting themselves into. So I think that's probably why I don't really have a problem with it, because it's a very honest sport, boxing. When the bell goes, it is a very, very honest sport. And I don't see... You couldn't change it. You know, you couldn't change it. So, for example, just to go back to Joshua Dubois, there's a concussion test that doctors will give athletes in other sports called a Romberg test. And basically what you do is, if you think someone's concussed, you get them to stand still, feet together, back nice and straight, arms by their side, get them to close their eyes, and you count from 1 to 10. And they should be able to do that and stand still. If there's some swaying in the spine, then the signals from the brain aren't maybe what they should be. And based on how they are, the doctor will decide whether they feel they are concussed or not. Now, at the end of round 1, there's no way on earth that Joshua would have passed that Romberg test, right? Because he was concussed. But you start administering those in between rounds in boxing matches and saying that someone can't continue because the doctor's decided that they're concussed. The sport would be finished.
Well, yeah.
The sport would be finished because it's an intrinsic part of boxing.
Chris Eubank Sr. did famously say boxing is a mug's game.
They're talking about the business side there. They know that there's nothing more honest than when the bell goes are two highly trained athletes who have agreed to abide by the rules of the ring, going at it. You know, there's nothing... That's why, you know, the four corners of truth is a great description of the ring, because it is that. You very rarely see a fighter trying to cheat. Somebody might lose their head and headbutt someone, or they might get themselves disqualified if they know they're losing. So it's very, very occasionally, but hardly ever do you see someone, say, get hit low and make a meal of it, or not get hit low but pretend they have been, or get hit on the break or slightly too late and it hasn't really hurt them, but they'll just go down and stay down and try and get the other bloke DQ'd. Once in a blue moon it happens, but it almost never does, because that is just not... It's just not who they are.
Often after a big knockout fight, you'll see fans decrying the fact that commentators, particularly those that are invited into the ring right after a fight, interview these fighters when they're concussed, when they're at their lowest ebb physically, and they say, why do they do this? It's so unfair. I mean, it's almost the moment that you have to ask the question, how do you feel? And yet it's the worst time in the world to ask that question, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the post-fight interview is tricky because, and it's true really of any sport, you know, if somebody's just won an Olympic gold medal, then obviously brilliant. But if they've just lost, then that's 4 years of work and they might not get another chance, and you're catching them potentially at the lowest moment of their life and demanding answers. And depending on the sport and depending where it is in the world, people can be quite, you know, they're not very kind sometimes or not very subtle. They can be quite clumsy. And with boxing, I do feel for them when they're interviewed. And the British Boxing Board of Control take a strict view on whether they will or won't allow someone to be interviewed. They would have been borderline with Joshua against Dubois. They'd have been thinking, should we be letting him do this? But this is a massive occasion. It's a massive stage. People want to hear what he's got to say. He wants to say something. And the doctor's checked him and the doctor says, yeah, this is okay for us to do this. If that had been a small hall show, I suspect they may well not have allowed him to do an interview. But it is difficult because they've been fighting, number one. And number two, if you've lost, it's very, very personal. It's more personal boxing than any other sport. Even if you've got no problem with your opponent, it's a very, very personal thing. So it's something that people want. They do want to hear from them. But I'm kind of glad that I don't really have to do it myself anymore because it's tricky. It is really tricky. And you saw with Joshua in his second fight against Alexander Usyk in Saudi Arabia, he did a lot better in the second fight than he did in the first. He got comprehensively beaten in the first, took the rematch, did much better in the second, but still did lose. And at the end of the fight, he just had a meltdown, didn't he? He left the ring and then he came back to the ring and he took the microphone, and all the frustration and all the criticism he'd been getting just came pouring out of him. And I was looking at him and I just felt so sorry for him.
And you were right to, because a lot of people interpreted that meltdown as confirmation of what they perceived as his arrogance, but actually this was a man in agony, in pain, absolutely grieving, confused,
just crushed, just absolutely crushed,
and wanting, and obviously having so much he wanted to say, so much he wanted to explain, to tell people. Complicated fighter, complicated man. 4 quick fire questions before we tuck in.
Yeah.
Best knockout in boxing history?
Christ, that is a really good question. My favourite is Froch Groves, from my viewing lifetime. I mean, again, it's from my viewing lifetime. I love Marquez against Pacquiao. There's been a few back in the day. There's been a few great ones back in the day. Floyd Patterson, Ingemar Johansson, there was a couple in there.
These are quick fire questions, Andy.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Go on.
We'll go with Froch Groves. That does appear in the book.
For me.
So anyone wondering why you've answered that, you can go to the book and find out exactly why. Second, worst knockout in boxing history. I guess what I'm alluding to by worst is the one that really leaves a bad taste in the mouth.
There was one, I think it was Ray Mercer, Tommy Morrison. That was a bad one. That didn't need to happen. Bad knockouts are
worse
ones.
Than Smith versus Castillo?
When you say worse, for me, a really bad knockout is one that shouldn't have happened.
Oh, I see.
Because the referee should have got in and stopped it. It shouldn't have happened.
Third, who wins? Bivol, Beterbiev in October.
Beterbiev, I think.
And fourth and finally, Fury Usyk 2.
Usyk.
And will it come by knockout?
No, I'll say points.
Andy Clarke, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for bringing me to Fiore Truck, and thank you very much for writing this fantastic book, The Knockout, Sport's Most Decisive Moment.
Thanks for having me.